Hello and welcome to this week's Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs programme. I'm Emma Webb, your host, and this week I'm joined by Senior Fellow and Cultural Historian Philip Kiszely and Baroness Fox. So before we begin, let me just remind you that if you haven't already checked this out, please take a look at our new latest Heresies documentary with Michael Collins on Labour's dislike of the working class, and our recent So What You're Saying Is episode with Juliet Samuels talking about human resources departments. So let's begin by talking about the leadership campaign, which is everywhere in the news this week. Obviously, this is going out after the time of filming, so even in the time we're discussing this, a lot of things could be very different.
Like last week, actually.
Yeah, quite. So, do you have a favourite, or is there somebody that you think is, a pretty sure bet, or do you think that this really is an open field?
I mean, I'm not in the Conservative Party, and one could be very dispirited when one looks at the wide range of people standing, because rather than thinking, oh, what a diverse and interesting crowd of people, you actually think, oh God, no, please don't let it be X, Y, Z, X, Y, Z, X, Y, Z. And I'm afraid that the favourites at the moment, I do not think will be able to encapsulate the great Brexit spirit that I think gave the Conservatives an 80-seat majority. That's my general feeling. Of favourites, of course, the surprise doing rather well as we speak for somebody who you wouldn't have thought a week ago would have even stood is Kemi Badenoch. Mainly because she's got an intellectual core to what she's saying. It makes sense to me. I'm very interested in the cultural issues. I think people underestimate completely the importance of having positions on those things, and she's already got that track record, so that's very encouraging. And actually it's fascinating, certainly on social media and amongst people I've spoken to, that they have discovered her and like the sound of her and are really responding to her. But I don't know that she will be able to, fight her way through the machine politics of the big names. I just want to say the only other thing is that I cannot understand the appeal of Penny Mordaunt, who's doing very well. And I keep being told she appeals to a certain type of Conservative. I mean, I don't know what kind, but the main reason why I have serious reservations about Penny Mordaunt is because of the issue around the trans question and the women question. And when I first went into the House of Lords, one of the first bills I dealt with was the maternity leave bill, and the fact that it didn't contain the word woman or mother. And Penny Mordaunt, as I understood it, as I was led to believe it at the time, was the barrier to inserting the word woman or mother in that bill, and was very cross about the fact that eventually a compromise hard fought for allowed the word mother to go in, but not the word woman, and was closely followed by Penny Mordaunt taking to the Commons and declaring that trans women are women and so on. Now, the reason I'm saying that story is not to go on about the trans issue, but because Penny Mordaunt then put out a thread. Great, she seems to have changed her position. I'm delighted, except within that thread, she denied she had anything to do with the maternity bill, and is almost like being gaslighting anyone who dares challenge her. This is not encouraging.
It's interesting as well, because I think that, firstly, I agree with you about Penny Mordaunt, and I find it really curious that she seems to be popular with certain segments of the party, because maybe it's just that they can't see past this kind of military persona that she's made for herself. She's sort of made herself in the mould of Margaret Thatcher, and perhaps people can't see through it and aren't aware of all of the ways in which she's been very, very, very woke on social issues.
Well, there's another thing as well, isn't there? That's just come out recently. She collaborated with a book or something where she'd been absolutely tearing into things like Dad's Army and some of the the cultural comedies and cultural products of the 60s and 70s, saying it's all of these things. It's white privilege, it's racism, it's sexism, and all of that kind of thing. So she seems to be, there seems to be a gaslighting thing going on here, where she's presenting herself as one thing, and it's so obvious that all of these other things are going on.
But that goes to the heart of part of the problem with the Conservative parties at the moment, is that people don't trust them. And she doesn't exactly inspire trust it's not so much doing a U-turn on her beliefs, but denying her involvement in the first place. Rishi also doesn't inspire trust, and I imagine he'd be plagued by a lot of the same problems that Boris Johnson was plagued by. So are there any in that top batch at the moment, those who are ahead, Liz Truss, Penny Mordaunt and Rishi Sunak, that could unify the party and inspire enough trust to not lose all of those marginal seats in the former Red Wall?
So as an outsider, my feeling is that we are watching a Conservative Party imploding anyway. And for some time I've been convinced that the Conservative Party can't hold itself together, and that actually it's two different parties struggling to get out. And I think the individualised way that people, first of all, got rid of Boris Johnson, ultimately, that when I say individualised, it was kind of like watching their own backs. The whole thing felt like it fell apart. Now we have a series of people standing without any real sense, it seems to me, of a real mission for the country, right? A vision for what we're going to have.
With the exception of Kemi.
With the exception of Kemi, but she, as I say, is an outside runner in many ways. But also there doesn't seem to be an appreciation of that unique quality that she's got of those people standing.
One of the interesting things about her and the way people talk about her is, they say she's young, and I don't think that's the most interesting thing about her. The interesting thing about her is that she's got a coherent intellectual vision, and it's a conservative intellectual vision in which none of the others actually have. And I think that's the most important thing.
And actually, David Cameron was younger than her when he took over the
He was 43, I think,
Party.
actually. No, I think he was 43.
So
she's 42, isn't she? So, but, near as damn it. The good thing about her, of course, is that she can always come back, and if people are discovering her now, the interesting thing is that the grassroots love her.
Yeah.
And
even if she doesn't, succeed all the way to the final two, even if she doesn't win, this isn't the end.
No, this is the beginning of a future.
She's great, but I'm talking about the party. I mean, she was always a bit of a star for me anyway, because she's been extremely brave in confronting things like critical race theory. She's spoken out about the divisive nature of identity politics in general. Some of her work on education has been exemplary. Etc., etc. So I'd already, I think she existed. Now she's got a much bigger platform, and that's great, and that's, that's positive. But what I'm talking about is, this is the Conservative Party of government, and I'm suggesting that they don't know what they're doing. Right?
Do you think they know what's good for them? Do you think they look at Kemi and they recognise that, in my opinion, Kemi is exactly what the Conservative Party need? But do they not recognise?
I don't think that even Boris Johnson understood what happened in 2019. Political realignment's a big deal. Generations upon generations upon generations of people who'd never voted Conservative did. There was a huge shake-up based on what had happened around Brexit in 2016. There was a mandate to shake up politics, change politics for good, actually, a phrase that I rather like. But, to do something, right? And I think that he encapsulated that when he stood, and people voted for that, but they were loaning votes to the Conservative Party to really change things. And I don't think it's sufficient to say, and then COVID came along, because, in the midst of COVID, for example, in the midst of that, the Conservative Party put on this huge international show of COP26 in Glasgow. I mean, they could have had a huge international show of we're going to lead the way in fighting back against identity politics, or even of industrialising the country with a new economic.
They had so many opportunities, didn't they? It's like you say, the COVID thing is just completely off. It's not even there. It's everything to go at. Everything to change. But he was a campaigner, and he was a brilliant campaigner. He just wasn't a prime minister, and had no vision. And I think I think you're right. She's going to come back. I don't think they know what's good for them. I don't think they've got any idea what's good for them, because they don't really understand. I think you've got to have spent time in those places, especially those northern constituencies, to understand the depth of that, what that meant, that 2019 moment meant. And I've spent lots of time there. I grew up there. I fully understand it. It's huge. But I think once it happened, it was like, okay, that's done. All right, let's carry on. I'm being Prime Minister.
Do you think
again.
that the likes of Lord Heseltine are right that with Boris gone, that Brexit is somehow in peril? Do you think that there are people within the party, within the Conservative Party, who would jeopardise that?
So I think that because many people in the cabinet, not just Boris Johnson, many people in senior positions in the Conservative Party saw Brexit as a technical matter of leaving the European Union, and that's why the kind of oven-ready deal and get Brexit done, these glib phrases, which, credit that we finally did leave the European Union, and we wouldn't have left the European Union had not the 2019 election happened, and we know that. But the spirit of Brexit, which is what was mattered, the democratic spirit, the opportunity to grasp hold of an electorate that suddenly went, we matter and we want to be part of this new change and so on.
And redefine ourselves.
Exactly, that has been squandered. And so the reason I say that is because I think that it's overstating it, and there's quite a lot of conspiratorial, oh, they're going to make us rejoin. And I think that there are undoubted forces who imagine now that they can dampen Brexit technically, and I do think there could well be a betrayal of the Northern Irish protocol issue not being resolved and the EU still having a say, and all of those things are true. But the thing that I think I'm most worried about is so few of them really seem to understand what it meant in general. So even though you can have Liz Truss going, yes, we'll go in hard on the Northern Irish protocol, they kind of got a technical sense of it. But I'm like, I want you to understand what the possibilities here were, and kind of like cutting taxes. I've got no objection, but God, it's dreary and it's unimaginative and it's low-hanging fruit.
Do you think this shows, sorry to cut you off, do you think, in addition to whatever you were about to say, do you think that this shows through in the platforms that they are putting forward during this leadership contest? So,
very definitely.
For example, Sajid Javid's speech it could have been any politician. You could have pulled him out and replaced him with anyone. It was nothing about it that was personally him. Kemi's was the only speech where it was distinctively her. The rest of them, it's almost like a sort of politics.
It's about the ship.
bot.
It's not about the captain and all the rest
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
it.
So do you think actually that a lot of that is, firstly, do you think that is showing through in the way that they are both thinking about their own policies and also what sort of leadership they would, what sort of leader they would be, but also in the way that they communicate that to the British public, that actually Boris Johnson wasn't the problem. The problem is with the party, and that they are not able to connect with the electorate. Kemi's speech, in my opinion, to keep going on about it, was the only speech that did that. The room was electric. Do you think that there is something really, really fundamental at the heart of the Conservative Party that just doesn't connect? And does that extend also to the other side of the house, that this is actually a political crisis that we're seeing at the moment played out in the Conservative Party, but it's a much broader issue?
Yeah, I think that the Conservative Party have lost any sense of identity, but I think they lost that a long time ago. They're struggling. They don't know who they are or what they are. I think the Labour Party is the same. We've talked about this before, haven't we? Where on the one hand, the Labour Party are this bunch of middle class identitarians, but on the other hand, it's the working class grassroots of the north, and never the twain shall meet. I think we talked about that last week. A similar kind of thing is happening in the Tory party, but it's not quite as defined. It's just this idea of progressives versus small c conservatives. And the progressives really don't know where they're going. There is no sense of steering the ship. And the small c conservatives are the way forward, because that's what most of the grassroots think. I mean, most of the grassroots, as I've just said, adore Kemi, and there's a reason for that. It's because she has a conservative vision, and the party as a whole just don't have that vision.
So we've just had the results come in from the next round of voting. Rishi is on 88, Mordaunt on 67, Truss on 50, Tugendhat on 37, Braverman on 32, Kemi on 40, Zahawi on 25, and Hunt has withdrawn. So Kemi is through to the next round.
and Nadim Zahawi's out,
Yeah.
and Hunt, so we have to look at where those votes go. But to go back to your question, but I think we can relate it to this, which is, my feeling is that the political parties have been gutted, and that things have changed enormously internationally. So it's not just the UK.
This great realignment is happening in
the great realignment is
States.
happening in all sorts of places. Well, it's also, I think France is the big story for me, which is that the two main parties, the equivalent of the Conservative and the Labour Party, in the last election, between them got 7% of the vote. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, it's hard to imagine. But even when Macron recently did very well in the, well, he didn't. He got through on the presidential vote, and there was great sort of brilliant centrism's back, you know, populism's over, and then within a few weeks it was like, oh God, Le Pen, what? and so what I'd say is that we're in the middle of a historical shift politically, and I don't think that the British parties have quite understood that historical shift, because it took the form of Brexit in the UK rather than through the parties, if that makes any sense. The problem when I look at those videos that you were referring to is that they don't have any heart. I mean, I don't see Kemi as, I mean, you know, you can say it's conservatism. I think she's got obvious principle and philosophy and some ideas behind her. I look at these kind of slick machines and I just see technocracy, and that's what people were reacting against, these kind of like technocrats who you can do your sound bites to and your slogans to, but it bears no relationship.
It's inauthenticity, and it inspires distrust.
And when I've talked to people, I've just had lots of meetings over the last few days for a variety of reasons, and with all sorts of types across a wide range of political spectrums. Actually, this leadership campaign has been rather dispiriting for people. They didn't know a lot of them. Now they're getting to know them, and they're actually very underwhelmed.
Really disappointed.
So they actually look at them and go, oh God, is that the leadership of the Conservative Party? But just to make sure that I am balanced, the Labour Party's absolutely finished. I mean, you know, we've just had a huge strike at the RMT, right? It doesn't matter what you think about that strike. I rather supported it up with the workers and all that. That's not the point. The Labour Party, it represents Labour in this country. Wouldn't let their front bench go on the picket lines, and the Conservatives were able to go, some of them did. And I was thinking, that's not really an accusation. They're meant to represent the working people of this country, and instead all they do is talk about poor people suffering the cost of living crisis, as though they're kind of like Victorian philanthropists who want to help the poor.
And interestingly also the comments that they've made about the ethnic backgrounds of the people running in the leadership for the Conservatives,
absolutely shocking.
Just goes to show that they don't have, I mean, anywhere close the diversity. Not that I hate putting it in those terms, because in the Conservative Party, these people are running because on the basis of their merit. They're not there because they've been selected to fill some kind of quota. But the Conservative Party had Disraeli as an MP, who would now be described as BAME.
But I think
before this was even a conversation.
I think the key thing here is just to pick up on what Claire's just said about how dispiriting the whole thing is. Rishi on what, 88? Is that right? That says it all, doesn't it? You know, how dispiriting is that? What do
you think is going? You say the Labour Party's over. Is the Conservative Party over if someone like Rishi, Liz Truss, or Penny Mordaunt is at the helm?
I personally think so, but I'm not saying it's like all over tomorrow. What I'm talking about,
these things don't happen like that.
No,
do they?
I mean it could take 10 years. I might well be long dead. You know, what I mean is we're talking about the gutting of political parties of any ideological coherence, and that's what I'm talking about. And I think that's what political realignment is. I think what's really worrying for the Conservative Party is that the MPs don't seem to have noticed. And so they're going for, they're kind of, I mean, who do they think is going to vote for Rishi Sunak? What are they on? I mean, this is like mad. And then when you think that the kind of big challenger is Penny Mordaunt, you think, oh my God, what is wrong with you lot? And I feel as though the fact that they don't seem to know that, you know what I mean, is the worrying bit. I mean, I'm sure Rishi Sunak's a very nice, competent man. I mean, I don't want to like personalise it, But what does he represent? How will he work? And I don't mean because he's rich, by the way. Right? I definitely don't mean because he's rich. I mean, he hasn't said one thing that's made me think that he was interesting or that I'd want to spend half an hour with him. I mean, it's just like terrible when you're in a situation where these people are vessels and ciphers for sound bites.
Well, this shows, though, how out of touch the MPs are with the members as well, because they are, if you just look at the numbers on this list, when all of the polls suggest actually the members are roughly between Penny Mordaunt and Kemi. So on so many issues, as you mentioned, the gender issues, online safety bill, censorship and free speech, all of these things, it just suggests that they are completely out of touch in the way that they're focusing on, this is a point that Kemi made in her own speech, tinkering with these little technicalities about tax. They think that that's what's going to win them the votes.
But it's just so frustrating and annoying, isn't it? Because it's so obvious. It's so obvious what they should be doing, because we know what the grassroots think. We know what ordinary people think. We know what we think. But you know, they're gonna tinker with tax, as you say, and they think that will make the huge difference. There is no philosophy there. I keep coming back to that, and it's so depressing.
What do you think about the way this contest is being conducted, the sort of nastiness within the campaign, within the party? That's
maybe what I was referring to in relation to the kind of individualised nature of the campaign. It's felt the opposite of collegiate. Of course there's competition, and we don't expect when you've got a leadership election everyone's going to go around saying, well, you know, if you're Rishi Sunak, you don't go, well, I think Nadim Zahawi's a fantastic guy. You know, I understand that you're going to do that, but this has been dirty tricks all the way along, some very nasty briefings about people, dirt being spilt on people. This is the kind of and it's kind of, you know, you could sort of say it's like Machiavellian and quite good fun, but it seems vicious to me. And so consequently you don't feel as though they've got this greater you know, good of the greater good of the party, never mind the greater good of the country. And obviously one of the difficulties is that they've got to all work together. They've got to somehow get through this, because they're still in government, form a cabinet and run the country at one of the most challenging times that any of us have lived through historically from an economic point of view, but also because we know that the country is divided in lots of other ways, and there's some really terrible challenges, and we've got war at the heart of Europe, which is itself presenting us with real difficulties.
What happened to Ukraine? Nobody's talking about Ukraine. Ukraine has barely featured in this contest.
It's just disappeared, hasn't it? Yeah, it's amazing to kind of to listen to what they're saying, and only a few weeks ago you couldn't get away from everything was about Ukraine. You know, it was the centre of, you know, the European experience. It was pivotal to the future, and now it's all about tax.
Boris was obviously very popular with the Ukrainians, with Zelensky, and one of the redeeming qualities one of the redeeming features of his premiership is the way that he dealt with Ukraine. So in this interim period between now and when the new leader is in post, what do you see as happening in relation to Ukraine in that period of time? Because it's quite important, it's quite pivotal that we're able to respond appropriately. Does this signal weakness to Russia and to China and to our enemies abroad? And also, depending on which candidate gets in, how do you see this playing out?
I think that just I suppose one of the difficulties is, and this is an atmosphere of nihilism in the country more broadly, that is something that I would want any government to really challenge and try and deal with, because there's quite a cynical attitude to Ukraine amongst a lot of ordinary people, because they haven't, well, for example, Boris Johnson going over to Ukraine a lot was started to be greeted with, oh, he's only going over there in order to bolster it. And it became, which was actually a bit depressing to me, because that seemed to me, of all the criticisms, wasn't the appropriate one. But I also think that in order to maintain the kind of support that one would need to give Ukraine through this period, which does demand, to a certain extent, sacrifice, or at least an acknowledgement that it could demand sacrifice, you have to have some really frank, open, you can't just kind of like fly the flag, right? But it means arguing, having grown-up conversations about things like the importance of sovereignty, what's really going on, some probably rows about what our priorities ought to be in relation to this. And I think that there's a real aversion to having those kind of grown-up conversations with the public amongst the political class, and therefore don't talk about Ukraine. You know what I mean? I mean, there was actually just a bit of a question in the House of Lords, and it was actually quite gratifying that across where everyone was sort of saying how important it was. So I don't necessarily think it's going to lead to a policy change, but I think we all have to acknowledge that if we're talking about political realignment internationally, we're also talking about a geopolitical realignment and the fraying of the post-war and then post-Cold War arrangements. Some very big decisions are going to have to be made about relationships with places like China.
I think there's just one thing to add to that as well, and it's the nature of the conflict, which could escalate dramatically at any moment. Now, it seems to me that a few weeks ago, we were all aware of that. We were all aware of the rhetoric around the nuclear arms. That seems, we seem to have done this thing where we've just, put that away, and we've completely forgotten about that, because this is present, and that's in a way that's kind of old news. It's going on, it's not changing that much. It's a war of attrition, where this is all new and there are different people resigning, and it's all exciting. But that very definite threat that it could escalate at any time is something that we should really bring back to the table and think about, and think with that in mind how we help
Do you think that
Ukraine.
Performative politics has become an actual security threat? That the performative politics breeds this kind of mediocrity, where there are no adults in the room, because everybody's just sort of playing at being a part. They're playing. Everybody keeps talking about who
I think
who's more like Margaret Thatcher.
I think it's performative politics is one thing, but I also think career politicians is another thing. That idea that people just go into politics for a career rather than going into politics as a calling. And that can be on both sides. I don't think it just needs to be one or the other. But again, we come back to the runners and riders there, don't we? And we see so many career politicians and performers as well, at any opportunity to mention Margaret Thatcher, and really, are you talking about Margaret Thatcher here? Or are you actually talking about Willie Whitelaw? Or are you talking about, who are you really talking about here? And do you have a grasp of what went on then? Because listening to you, I don't think you do.
But it's also, I mean, the Thatcher thing actually drives me mad, because, I mean, somebody sort of supported the miners and hated Margaret Thatcher. During
it's
that whole period.
It's not going to play well in the Red Wall, is it?
No, but I'm not saying it for that reason. What I'm saying is, but I could acknowledge that Margaret Thatcher came out of an intellectual, also did come out of, you only have to read all that IEA, theorising and the kind of ideas about a new kind of economy, a new kind of vision of the UK that she embodied, right? So she wasn't just like a performative performer, you know what I mean?
No, she was involved with Roger Scruton in the 70s, wasn't
and she was also up against it. Yeah. She was a dark horse. She had a vision that clashed with a lot of people.
Well, even if there were other people who had a vision, and she was also the person who ended up embodying it. But what I mean is, it came out of an intellectual struggle that was going on in the Conservative Party. What we've got now is not coming out of an intellectual struggle going on in the Conservative Party, because there is none. There's a personality row going on about, as you say, the kind of performative nature. But I was just thinking about when you were saying about Ukraine, and I think Philip's saying about what's at stake and escalation. But I think if you look at what's happening around the world at the moment, things like Sri Lanka, for example, where there's now a kind of argument about what is, I just walked out of a short debate where the Labour Party is saying, what are we doing to give aid to Sri Lanka? And, the government's saying, no, we're doing everything we can, we're getting the Brits out. I mean, what's happened in Sri Lanka is an economic crisis, partly created by the lockdown policies that basically closed down the global economy and destroyed their tourism for a start off. I mean, a massive cut of their GDP. But also comes out of eco-orthodoxies that demanded that agricultural country dependent on fertilizers couldn't use fertilizers, right? And the crops have failed, and so on top of having closed down the global economy and destroyed their economy that way, the Western preoccupation with green orthodoxy. Anyway, none of this gets mentioned, but the Sri Lanka situation's quite a big issue, and these things can spill out.
It's the same with the Dutch farmers as well.
Then
This
you've
is
got the Dutch
something that should be a political issue here. We should have politicians coming out in support of the Dutch farmers. And in some ways, I mean, I keep going back to Kemi, but it's because I agree with her. The only person I've seen so far questioning this sort of committed eco-orthodoxy is Kemi, talking about just pursuing net zero at the expense of everything else, at the expense of people's lives.
Exactly, but I'm saying there's a lot going on in the world that should be the topic of debate and conversation. There should be a situation where, I mean, it might sound silly to say, well, why would Penny Mordaunt put that in a campaign video? But I mean, I'm sort of serious in a way, which is to acknowledge that around the world there's some really serious things happening, and that the UK left the European Union but is part of the world. And I think that one of the points about the kind of career politicians we've got, and the points that you were making, Philip, is that I do genuinely think that being part of something like the EU, and this isn't just like a blame the EU, but I think that the political class forgot how to rule. I mean, they were so busy outsourcing decision making to Brussels, or they got basically everything became legalistic, technocratic. They felt far more at home over there, where you take your policy to Brussels or Strasbourg, then you come back and say to the British people, well, what could we do? It's been imposed on us. I mean, there was always a kind of con.
But I think,
but they also lost the capacity to think, what does it mean to be a player? What does it mean to have negotiating skills? What does it mean to convince ordinary people in this country of a policy? Because all they had to do was to say it's a fait accompli.
There's this kind of slavish, like, punch yourself in in the morning and out in the evening, and just push pencils all day, dig some holes, fill them in.
What we're talking about there are two things, aren't we? We're talking about strategy and the ability to kind of organise and think about what's important and what might not be as important. But beneath that is a layer of broader ideas, and there's a real poverty there. But I think it's been there for about 15-20 years.
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's something that's completely new, but every now and again there's a flashpoint, and it's often something like this where people are running for leadership, and it's almost like they're exposed, isn't it? We see the flesh and we see what they really are, and it's very unattractive, but it's very uninspiring as well.
And I think it's been there a long time, and that's all I'm saying is the upheaval that was a kind of reassertion of, politics has got to change. You can't just carry on like this, which in the UK's context was the vote to leave the European Union, was then, first of all, attempted to be thwarted, and then wasn't grasped even when it was grasped. So the possibilities of what you could do with the kind of energy that was released by that 2016 vote, which wasn't quelled even though the whole of the establishment turned on the voters. If you could have taken that energy, you could have done an awful lot with it. But the political class that had been leading us and didn't really want a referendum and thought they were going to actually win a referendum to stay in and kind of business as usual, just haven't got the wherewithal in a way to know what to do with this, and that includes Boris Johnson. And whatever, it's not to kind of dance on his grave, and he's not gone anywhere. He's still the Prime Minister. It's so ironic, but that there is something about that, him writing those two editorials, not being sure which way he'd go back in 2016. That does give you a flavour of the fact that although he deserves credit for riding the wave in 2019, and I do want to give him credit, right? And that did take some courage. It wasn't entirely, and they had to really face down their own, colleagues in the political elite, and that took something. But nonetheless, it gives you an indication that he didn't really mean it, and that none of them really meant it. And that is, I think, what's becoming apparent to people, because you keep asking us about, well, not keep up, but for me, the gap is, and I don't understand this, you've got the Parliamentary Conservative Party, You've then got the membership, who I don't know. That's the truth, right? I mean, they're not really my type. You know, I don't know. I just mean I'm not familiar.
Part of the Tory
right?
party, yeah.
They're not part of the Tory party. And then you've got the voters, of which there are millions. And there's a gap. There's different gaps along that road.
I wonder how many actually in those marginal seats in the Red Wall actually became members of the Conservative Party. Because I bet probably not that many.
No,
Probably not a
will.
huge amount.
So before,
so can I just pick up on that point of energy, because I think it's really, really important, and there is no energy here, right? The last time I felt it was kind of Brexit night, I suppose, but the time before that was the 2014 European elections, where UKIP just did that amazing thing, and there were I'd never seen anything like that, I don't think, in my adult life of voting and what was happening there. That was a remarkable night, and you felt the energy from the party, you felt the energy from people. And just as you were talking about that, I was comparing the two things, and I was just thinking, we know we're in trouble here, but we really are in trouble here with the major political parties. So it's not about trying to save the major political parties or reconfigure them. It's about looking elsewhere, isn't it? It's about looking to a Brexit party, or to a UKIP, or to these smaller parties, and thinking about how they can galvanise, how they can get bigger, and how they can work.
We're going to have to move on to the next subject, but first I just wanted to ask you about that energy. Do you think that energy has dissipated because it didn't find find the kind of containment that it should have had? Or do you think that it has been sort of put back in the box and is still there festering, wanting to get out, waiting for the right vessel basically to carry it forward into this realignment?
So I'd love it to be small parties that Philip suggested, but there's no evidence of that yet. I don't think it's gone, by the way. I don't think it things like that.
It won't go.
It's still there.
You don't think people are so fed up that they've just thought?
But your festering point's important. I think an awful lot of people have gone down very mad rabbit holes in the lockdown period.
And the nihilism that you mentioned.
As an expression, well, it's actually that's partly it. It's the nihilistic conspiracy mongering. And there are people who I know are totally energised by, drawing graphs with lines between you think, oh my God, and you were a normal person once. Do you know what I mean? And they're kind of like, all their energy is on the World Economic Forum and the WTO. And I'm just like, oh God. Oh God! I mean, it's not that there aren't things to say about those organisations. I just mean they've gone a bit peculiar. There's that. Some people's energy has gone into taking on the culture wars, and I think that there's been a great deal of energy, particularly around gender critical life, as it were, and a kind of resurgence of a form of feminism, or even people who aren't feminists getting involved in the gender critical stuff, or maybe around the challenge to critical race theory. All of these things, we see it around GB News, we see it around talk radio and all the rest of it. But it's all over the place, and some of it's negative. That's the problem. It's not all positive, because it can turn nasty. So you can't just guarantee that people's seething resentments at being sidelined in political life and in a democracy expresses itself in the way I'd like it to, in a very kind of like pro-Kemi Badenoch tight positive movement. So it's all to play for, a lot to fight about.
Well, the one key thing now, which we had it in 2014, but it wasn't as prevalent, is the Twitter world, isn't it? Where all of that energy that you're talking about, whatever happens, it becomes poisonous, because it's such a poisonous platform, and that's where that's the public square, isn't it? But I'd kind of answered the question before a little bit, I think.
You anticipated it.
The people at the helm are the wrong people, and the helm is wrong. The whole thing, the whole setup is completely wrong.
Systemically problematic.
It's systemically broken.
Oh dear, are we being too pessimistic?
Well, this isn't going to make us any more optimistic. Let's talk about grooming gangs. We have to talk about it as here and also as a country. So Philip, do you want to start by telling us what's been going on with this Telford Inquiry that was in the news today?
Well, this is just staggering in its scale, The Telford Inquiry it's not surprising. It's essentially authorities, the police, frightened of intervening in what is child abuse, rape, and children have died as well, and the numbers are in their thousands, and it's been going on for 30 years. Okay, in Telford, and they've constantly turned a blind eye to this. That this can happen is just utterly appalling. But the really interesting thing to me is that this is news, and this is big news. But on all across social media that we've just been talking about, the identitarian left are completely silent about it. Mm-hmm. So it was a conspiracy of silence that resulted in rape, abuse and death, and that conspiracy of silence is continuing. Yeah. And that is absolutely appalling.
That's an interesting point, that actually the fact that a lot of these girls, all of these girls, didn't see justice, weren't listened to. One of the reasons was because the police didn't want to be seen as racist, which is the same as we saw in Rotherham. They didn't want to cause disruption within the Muslim community, so they just decided, in order to, not be accused of racism, that they were just going to let these girls suffer. That actually that is taking place on a kind of meta level in society at large, that we're still not talking about this properly. It's not in the news properly. This has been going on since the 1980s at least, and none of this gets discussed because people are afraid that if they discuss it, they'll be called right wing.
It's always the way, not just with grooming gangs, but with any kind of atrocity that happens. If there's a bombing or something like that, then there's this pause, isn't there? And then if it's some kind of Combat 18 right-wing nutter, there's this kind of exhale and everybody can have a go. And then if it's not, if it's an Islamist extremist, then all of those people are silent. And it's like a cancer at the heart of the culture. We really need to address it.
Does this get much attention within Parliament?
No, I mean, I've mentioned it. There's no opportunity to mention it. There's a debate that I'm involved in tomorrow on, women and girls in society, and I'm going to make it the focus. I only get a few minutes, but I will make it the focus of it. And I'm going to make the point that I can't believe it's not the talk of the town, or, that we're not talking about it. I think it goes beyond. I mean, the grooming gang scandal does get to the heart of the point that we've just been discussing, which is industrial scale sexual abuse of largely white working class girls who nobody cares about, right? Nobody gives a damn about, who were either not believed or they didn't matter sufficiently. The perpetrators, because they were from the Asian community, it wasn't just and specifically parts of the Muslim community. They actually explicitly in the Oldham inquiry report didn't just say that people didn't intervene because of racism. They said they didn't intervene because they didn't want to encourage far right Islamophobia. So you've got a kind of conscious political intervention by the authorities. Well, if we intervene, then this will be used by the Tommy Robinson types, and
a value judgment there about people. So who can we just throw away? Is it this person A or is it person B? It's person B. Let them be the victims, and
to allow actual wrongdoing justified by imagined wrongdoing.
Exactly, but also the point that you were making about, for example, if there's a Islamist terrorist attack, when you say there's silence, but there's also lectures about how people are not to be Islamophobic. So it's like you end up being told off for being furious. It's like, I'm sorry, but
Oh, you're not allowed to be furious. You've got to look. You don't look back in anger. Don't look back in anger.
So I think that it becomes a critique of, again, the British working class, and the British working class is largely white because we're in the UK, but it's not wholly white. I mean, that also really irritates me, right? Because everybody should be furious about this. And many people are furious about this, regardless of ethnicity, but it's completely sidelined. And the point about it is their discussion in Parliament. I'll tell you what, Parliament gets carried away with, the Westminster Village, the political elite, Me Too stories, right? Pestminster. Endless
they're more
conversation
interested
about
than an MP looking at pornography on their phone rather than girls getting raped.
So-and-so's great, all terrible things, right? But we endless reams of comment on widespread systemic misogyny in Whitehall than there is about the fact, well, we know that these girls, they're being raped and you know about it and you won't even ask a question in Parliament.
It's interesting as well on the Me Too stuff that people so often talk about rape culture, but they will never talk about rape culture when it relates to a minority community. Everything is systemic except when it's something to do with a minority. Not that I'm suggesting that this is a systemic problem. I don't believe in things like that. I think
there's
that's
one other point, isn't there? The identitarians will tell us that this country is the most racist country in the world and all the rest of it. And we know, don't we, from the way people react, the danger of being called racism. We know it's an absolute anathema to them. It's terrible.
Yeah, exactly.
That wouldn't be the case in a country that was racist.
Well, that's what's so ironic about this.
It's just completely ironic.
It's also the case, and this is very important, which is we should be able to have an open and frank conversation about why certain parts of communities believe that young white working class women are disposable trash.
Literally.
So that conversation should happen. But of course, what's more worrying is, why did the councils, the teachers, the social workers, they ultimately created that? Because you can have a crisis about, that particular community over there, and so on and so forth. But what worries me is how come you can be in a situation whereby British institutions also think that these young women were disposable and
victim blaming as well, calling them child prostitutes.
Yeah, you're prostitutes, and one girl I saw, I'm in the middle of discussing the schools bill. It's all about young people not going into school and so on, and who's not going to school. Some young 14-year-old girl kicked out of school and given a lecture by her teacher. This is in the report. Given a lecture by a teacher about she shouldn't sleep around because she got pregnant when she was 14. She was bloody raped, right? And part of this whole thing, and she, this is, as you say, victim blaming, phrases that you kind of I steer away from in many instances. But anyway, maybe there are things to be learned. Maybe there are things to be said. But we're not having the conversation. So these inquiries come out and that sort of disappears.
And it's all linked as well, isn't it? So this idea of, you're not allowed to say this or you're not allowed to use that is not a million miles away from people saying you're not allowed to use the word woman. You're not
completely related.
You're not allowed. You can't have freedom of speech because freedom of speech is dangerous. All of these things are related, and ultimately it comes back to open freedom of expression and the freedom to express fear and anger. I'm not suggesting that we should all go on the rampage, but any society that can't express anger at atrocity is a society that's really in trouble.
But don't you think that, Philip, that's the thing? And this relates us back to the leadership election of the Conservative Party. This has not been a very major issue. I mean, the Telford issue has come out in the middle of a Conservative Party leadership election, and I don't know that Kemi's mentioned it, but it's not. You'd think that somebody would say, "I just want to now deplore." Even if it was like a nod to it. What I think happens is, from the point of view of British voters and the British public, is they're looking on and thinking, those I've overemphasised treating the young women like trash, but you're treating the whole of the electorate as though they don't count. If things which people say, well, don't you think we could mention this, please? So people are now absolutely furious and believe there's a conspiracy to not discuss the grooming scandal.
And that's actually an abuse of power, because like you were saying with this thread, demonstrating, you know, just the scale of the problem, the amount of areas that this has been going on.
This is a tweet that I was talking about before, that someone had said, let's put this in context because it's happened in all of these cities. And this thread goes, I've retweeted it myself, it goes on and on and on and on and on, and it's absolutely devastating. It's a devastating indictment
huge number of cities that we've forgotten, and you were saying Yeovil and so on.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up because we run over time, but thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Philip, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, comment below, and we'll see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.